I think there's a true divide in the Arab world and in the Palestinian population, and there are with the so-called confrontation rejectionist points of view, and that is that Israel has no right to exist. There's a true desire to destroy the state of Israel and to kill every Israeli, and it's part of a larger, I think, hatred of Jews and even hatred of Americans. I think in this case it's the hatred of Jews is primary. And when we in the West think about compromise and solutions and so forth, it's very hard for us to conceive that there are people in the world who would prefer generations, decades, centuries of bloodshed and struggle to finding a peaceful solution. It's just contrary to our way of thinking. And therefore, it's hard for us to understand that there's a population that is willing to die for decades and generations to destroy the state of Israel and to kill every Jew in Israel. It's just alien to our thinking. So there's a tendency for people to come to a solution and say, how can we solve this? And I think a very decent tendency of people in the Western world to seek compromise. And because we want to seek compromise, and I think a foundation of the liberal state is none of us can completely have our needs and interests met by the state in the public sphere. So what we do is we all compromise, we all leave something. And then in the middle we vote and we try to find a peaceful solution instead of fighting everything out and creating winners and losers. That's the model of the liberal state. I've mentioned it as far as community spirituality is the willingness to be reasonably unhappy. Not everybody gets everything they want, but what we create together is better than what we could create on our singly. So we all have some of our needs unmet, and we're willing to take the benefits and not have everything that we demand. So that's been the history, I think, of the Israeli negotiations with the non-rejectionist front, meaning Palestinians who say, okay, we're not going to have all the land, the Jews aren't all going to go away, we're not going to have the right of return. It's just not going to happen. On the other hand, we'll have a state, and it will have continuous borders, which many Israelis don't want. They very strongly fear a contiguous Palestinian state without Israeli security. But over time, Israelis have said, over time, if our security needs are met, there will be a Palestinian state. It may not be to our liking, but we'll have to live with it. So there's a degree of people in the region who are willing to sacrifice their ideal vision for a compromise. But in the Islamic world, there are those who are ideologically, theologically, in principle, against any compromise whatsoever. They want to destroy the state of Israel. Now, unfortunately, they have control over a landmass, the Gaza Strip, on the Israeli border. Although Israel did try to control access of weapons and armaments into Gaza, they've not been successful, partly because the border with Egypt has been so porous. And Hamas has been able to arm itself with not only small arms, but mortars, rockets, Grad missiles, and so forth, which establish maybe not an existential threat to Israelis, but something that's simply intolerable for a modern state to allow itself to be bombarded continuously with mortars, rockets, etc. It's just intolerable for any state to absorb this. And secondly, if at any point chemical weapons were attached to those missiles, it could cause unspeakable horror. It's possible. There's capacity for it. We know that in the Iran-Iraq war, the Iraqis especially used poison gas, chemical weapons against Iranians and also against their own people. So those weapons are out there. Israelis know this. So there's a certain point after the truce ended on December 19th that in addition to the hundreds of rockets that were being sent across, over 240 rockets or 300 rockets were sent in about a week period. And that's, again, there's no state that has the duty to absorb that. So Israel went on the offensive. From my perspective, Israel has been extremely conscientious in attempting to avoid civilian casualties. I'm reading very carefully on many websites across the spectrum. I've seen no evidence whatsoever of Israeli soldiers massacring Palestinian civilians, no evidence that Israel has purposely targeted a civilian target in order to kill civilians. I'm not saying there hasn't been mistakes, and I'm not saying something that we all know is that Hamas hides behind civilians and uses United Nations and civilian facilities. I'm not saying civilians haven't been killed, they have. But not intentionally by Israel to kill civilians. On the other side, we know that the Hamas rockets are sent indiscriminately into Israeli population centers. The fact that more Israelis haven't been killed is because the underground structure that Israel builds is to protect civilians, right? Not to attack Palestinians. If Israel wanted to, they could tunnel under the Gaza Strip and kill hundreds of thousands of civilians if they wanted to. Israel Air Force has the capacity to obliterate the Gaza Strip. The fact that there has been 700 killed on the Palestinian side, most of them 75% Hamas fighters, tragically some civilians, is not evidence of Israeli targeting civilians, but evidence of Hamas hiding among civilians.